That silver coin was supposed to save his ranch. By sunrise, it would save something else instead. The coin rolled slowly across Elias Boone's knuckles as he stood outside Mercer's general store with dust clinging to his boots and the dry Oklahoma wind pushing against his old canvas coat. It was the last dollar he had left in the world. One silver Morgan dollar worn smooth around the edges from years of changing hands between hungry men and desperate ones. Elias stared at it for a long moment beneath the pale evening sun. Tomorrow morning, the bank would take his ranch. 30 acres of dying grass, collapsing barn, 6 horses already too thin for winter, and the little hill behind the cabin where his wife Clara had been buried beneath a cedar cross 12 years ago. The banker had given him until sunrise. After that, everything was gone. Elias pushed open the creaking wooden door and stepped inside the store. Heat from the iron stove mixed with the smell of leather, tobacco, and old coffee grounds. A few men glanced toward him before looking away again. Folks in Dry Creek had learned to stop looking too long at poor men. The storekeeper, Vernon Mercer, stood behind the counter counting receipts beneath a flickering oil lamp. Then the door opened again behind Elias. Soft footsteps crossed the wooden floor. Quiet, careful. Elias turned slightly and saw her. A young Apache woman wrapped in a faded brown shawl dusted pale from the trail. Her dark braid rested over one shoulder, and there was exhaustion in the way she stood, like her legs had carried her farther than they were meant to. She couldn't have been older than 20. In her hands she held a small cloth pouch and a folded piece of paper. "Please," she said softly, placing the paper on the counter. "The boy's fever is getting worse." Mercer barely looked at her. "I told you already. Medicine costs money." She opened the pouch carefully. 2 nickels. 3 pennies. Mercer snorted under his breath. "That won't buy aspirin for a dog." The men near the stove chuckled quietly into their coffee cups. The girl lowered her eyes but didn't move. "Please," she whispered again. "He is only 10. Mercer slid the medicine bottle farther back on the shelf. "Take your people back to the hills. Dry Creek ain't your place." Silence settled over the room, the kind that felt heavier than noise. Elias watched the girl's hands tighten around the little pouch. She looked tired enough to fall where she stood, but there was something else in her face too. Fear. Not for herself. For someone waiting out there in the dark. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the distant plains. Mercer turned away dismissively. Stores closing. The Apache girl swallowed hard and nodded once. She reached for her coins slowly, trying not to let her hands shake. Then Elias stepped forward. The wooden floor groaned beneath his boots. He looked down at the silver dollar in his palm. The one thing standing between him and losing everything by morning. He thought about Clara, about the ranch, about winter coming early this year. Then he placed the coin gently on the counter beside the medicine bottle. The sound it made seemed louder than it should have. Every man in the store looked up. Elias slid the bottle toward the girl. "Give her the medicine," he said quietly. Mercer frowned. "Boone, that dollar was your payment tomorrow." Elias stared at the dust blowing beneath the doorway. "Not anymore." The Apache girl looked at him like she didn't understand what she was seeing. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Elias only nodded once toward the bottle. "Go on now," he said softly, "before the storm gets worse." Outside, the wind began to howl across Dry Creek as the girl disappeared into the gathering darkness, clutching the medicine against her chest. And none of the men sitting inside that little store understood they had just witnessed the moment that would change Elias Boone's life before the next sunrise. The storm reached Elias Boone's ranch just after midnight. Wind pushed through the loose boards of the barn with a long hollow whistle that sounded almost human in the dark. Elias sat alone at the small kitchen table beside a dying lantern flame, staring at the folded debt notice resting near his coffee cup. Final warning. The words looked darker tonight somehow. Meaner. Rain tapped softly against the windows while shadows moved across the cabin walls like ghosts drifting through old memories. Elias leaned back slowly in the creaking chair and rubbed his tired eyes. His stomach ached from hunger, but he ignored it. The last beans in the cupboard had gone bad 3 days ago, and there was no point thinking about food now. By tomorrow afternoon, none of this would belong to him anyway. Not the cabin. Not the horses. Not even the rusted branding iron hanging above the fireplace with the Boone family mark carved into old oak wood. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains again. Elias stood and stepped onto the porch. Cold wind brushed against his weathered face as he looked out over the ranch. The moon hid behind storm clouds, but he could still see the outline of broken fences stretching across the dirt like old scars. One of the horses shifted weakly near the barn. Too skinny, too tired, just like him. He pulled his coat tighter and walked slowly toward the cedar tree behind the house. Clara's grave rested beneath it, simple and quiet beneath the rain. The white paint on the cross had almost disappeared from years of dust and weather. Elias crouched beside it, boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. "I tried," he whispered. The wind answered instead. He stayed there a while listening to rain strike the dry ground. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats. Faint at first. Slow. Deliberate. Elias turned sharply toward the hills beyond his property. The sound faded, then returned again from another direction. He narrowed his eyes into the darkness. Riders. More than one. He could not see them clearly through the storm, only movement far off near the ridgeline where lightning briefly lit the horizon silver. His hand rested instinctively near the old rifle leaning against the porch rail, though he did not pick it up. The riders never came closer. They only watched. Silent shapes on horseback standing still beneath flashes of distant lightning. Elias felt the hairs rise along the back of his neck. Out here, silence usually meant trouble. One rider slowly raised an arm. Something caught the moonlight for half a second. Then the figures disappeared back into the darkness beyond the hills. Elias stood frozen in the rain long after they were gone. By the time he returned inside, muddy hoofprints circled the edge of his property. Careful, controlled, like scouts measuring land before sunrise. He barred the cabin door more out of habit than fear and lowered himself heavily into the chair beside the lantern. The flame flickered low now, almost dead. Elias unfolded the debt notice one final time. $2,000 owed to Dry Creek Bank. Payment due at sunrise. Failure to comply would result in immediate seizure of property and livestock. He stared at the paper until his vision blurred. Then something strange caught his eye near the doorway. Resting on the wooden floorboards just inside the cabin entrance was a single eagle feather tied carefully with red thread. Fresh rainwater still clung to it. Elias frowned slowly. He knew enough about the Apache to understand symbols mattered. Gifts mattered too. But this did not feel like either one. Felt like a warning. Outside, the wind carried another distant sound across the plains. Not thunder this time. Drums. Low. Steady. Somewhere beyond the darkness, hidden among the hills, someone had not gone to sleep tonight. Morning came gray and cold over Dry Creek. The storm had passed, but the town still smelled of wet dirt, smoke, and soaked leather. Elias Boone rode into town slowly on his old mare, Sadie, with the debt notice folded inside his coat pocket like a stone pressing against his chest. Every step of the horse sounded louder than usual on the muddy road. He could feel people watching him from the boardwalks and storefront windows. Folks always noticed a man on his final day before losing everything. Outside the bank, Sheriff Colton Briggs leaned against a wooden post sipping black coffee from a tin cup. Tall, clean hat, silver badge polished bright enough to catch the weak morning sun. He spotted Elias immediately and pushed himself upright with a slow sigh. "You came," Briggs said quietly. Elias dismounted stiffly, joints aching from the cold night. Never been much for running. The sheriff studied him for a long moment before glancing toward the bank doors. "Mr. Granger is inside already." Elias nodded once. Neither man moved at first. Wind carried the smell of fresh bread from the bakery across the street, and somewhere nearby a hammer struck metal in steady rhythm from the blacksmith shop. Normal town sounds. Ordinary sounds. Strange how the world kept moving even when a man's life was about to end. Briggs lowered his voice. You should have kept that dollar yesterday. Elias looked toward the muddy street. Maybe. Folks are talking about it. Folks talk about everything. The sheriff stared at him carefully. Those Apache riders outside town last night got people nervous. Elias felt his shoulders tighten slightly. You saw them too? Briggs nodded. 3 deputies counted at least 20 campfires out near Red Ridge before dawn. He paused. Nobody knows why they are here. Elias said nothing. His eyes drifted toward the hills beyond town where pale fog still rested over the distant land like smoke. Then movement near the edge of the street caught his attention. The Apache girl from the store yesterday stood beside the water trough near the livery stable. Same brown shawl, same tired eyes. But today she was not alone. 2 Apache scouts stood several feet behind her near their horses, silent as fence posts beneath the cold wind. They watched the town carefully without touching their weapons. Elias noticed townspeople avoiding that side of the street completely. The girl looked toward him briefly, just one glance. But this time there was no fear in her expression. Only quiet gratitude mixed with something harder to understand. Before Elias could move, the bank doors opened with a heavy creak. Milton Granger stepped outside holding a leather ledger beneath one arm. The banker was short, stiff-backed, and dressed too fine for frontier dust. Gold pocket watch, polished boots, thin lips that never smiled unless money changed hands. "Mr. Boone," Granger called sharply. "Right on time." Elias removed his hat slowly and climbed the wooden steps. Briggs followed behind him. Several townspeople began gathering nearby, pretending not to stare. Granger opened the ledger carefully. $2,000 due as of 8 o'clock this morning. He adjusted his spectacles. Failure to pay results in immediate transfer of property ownership to Dry Creek Bank. Elias breathed slowly through his nose. He could hear the creak of saddle leather somewhere behind him. Hooves shifting in mud. Wind tapping a loose sign against the bank wall. Granger dipped his pen into ink. "Do you have the payment?" Silence settled across the street. Elias opened his mouth to answer. Then all at once every horse in town seemed to go still. The sound of approaching riders rolled in from the edge of Dry Creek low and steady like distant thunder crossing the plains. The riders entered Dry Creek without a single shouted word. 20 Apache horsemen moved slowly through the muddy street beneath the gray morning sky, their horses stepping steady and calm, while townspeople backed away from windows and storefronts in frightened silence. Leather creaked softly. Rainwater dripped from saddle blankets. Eagle feathers stirred in the cold wind. Sheriff Briggs instinctively rested one hand near his holster, though he did not draw. Nobody did. Something about the way the riders carried themselves made the entire street hold its breath. Elias Boone stood frozen on the bank steps as the lead rider approached. The man was older than the others, broad-shouldered despite his age, with silver woven through his long black braid and deep lines cut into his face like weathered canyon stone. Around his neck hung a necklace of carved bone and turquoise beads that caught the pale morning light. His dark eyes settled on Elias immediately. Calm. Measuring. Certain. The Apache girl near the stable lowered her head respectfully as the older man rode past her. Elias understood then. This was no scout. No ordinary rider. This man carried authority the way generals carried medals. Milton Granger cleared his throat nervously and clutched the leather ledger tighter beneath his arm. "This bank conducts lawful business," he announced loudly, though his voice shook slightly. "There will be no trouble here today." The older Apache rider slowly dismounted. His boots touched the mud without hurry. One of the younger warriors handed him a worn leather satchel tied carefully with dark cord. The old man accepted it and climbed the bank steps toward Elias. Every eye in Dry Creek followed him. Even the horses seemed quieter now. Elias felt his heartbeat thudding hard beneath his ribs as the man stopped directly in front of him. Up close, he smelled cedar smoke and wet leather carried in from the storm. The Apache chief studied Elias for several long seconds before speaking in calm, careful English. "You gave medicine to my granddaughter." Elias glanced briefly toward the young woman near the stable. She stood perfectly still beneath the wind, watching silently. I only paid for it, Elias answered quietly. The boy needed help. The chief nodded once. Most men in this town saw only Apache blood. His eyes drifted toward the gathered crowd. You saw a sick child. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Somewhere down the street, a loose shutter banged softly against a building wall. The chief slowly opened the leather satchel. Inside rested stacks of folded bills and several heavy cloth bags that clinked faintly with coins. Gasps spread quietly through the crowd. Even Granger's face paled. The chief held the satchel toward the banker. How much does this rancher owe? Granger blinked rapidly behind his spectacles. $2,000, he muttered. The chief did not even look at him. Then count $2,000. Silence swallowed the street completely. Granger hesitated before taking the satchel with trembling hands. He carried it carefully inside the bank while two clerks hurried after him. Elias stared at the chief in disbelief. You do not owe me this, he said softly. The old man finally looked directly into his eyes again. Last night my grandson's fever broke before sunrise. His weathered expression remained steady, but something gentler appeared beneath it now. You gave away your final dollar for a child you did not know. He paused briefly. Men with full pockets walked away. You did not. Elias swallowed hard. The wind shifted across the muddy street carrying the distant smell of pine and rain from the hills. Across town, church bells began ringing the morning hour. Then the Apache chief reached slowly into his coat and removed something folded carefully in both hands. A debt notice. Elias recognized the paper immediately. His own signature rested near the bottom beneath the bank seal. The chief held it silently for a moment while the entire town watched. Then he stepped toward the oil lantern hanging beside the bank door. The flame touched the edge of the paper slowly at first. Just a small curl of orange against the white debt notice in Chief Dakota's weathered hands. Then the fire spread across the page in thin, glowing lines while the morning wind carried tiny black ashes into the air above Dry Creek. Nobody spoke. Milton Granger stepped forward instinctively as if to stop it, then froze halfway up the bank steps when 20 Apache riders shifted silently behind their chief. No weapons were drawn. None needed to be. The paper burned completely within seconds. Elias Boone stared at the drifting ashes with disbelief settling slowly across his tired face. Years of debt. Years of fear. Gone in silence beside a flickering lantern. Chief Dakota dropped the final blackened corner of paper into the mud and looked toward Granger calmly. Now the ranch belongs only to him. The banker swallowed hard and adjusted his spectacles with shaky fingers. Behind him, the two clerks emerged carrying the leather satchel now noticeably lighter than before. One clerk handed Granger a folded receipt with trembling hands. Granger glanced over the numbers twice before speaking quietly. Paid in full. The words drifted across the street almost too softly to hear. Yet somehow every person standing there heard them anyway. A murmur spread through the crowd. Men who had ignored Elias for years suddenly could not stop staring at him. Women standing beneath the awnings whispered behind gloved hands. Even Sheriff Briggs looked unsettled, as though he had just witnessed something larger than money changing hands. Elias removed his hat slowly, uncertain what to say. Chief! Dakota lifted one hand gently. My grandson lives because one stranger chose kindness over fear. He glanced toward the Apache girl near the stable. His name is Matto. The girl lowered her eyes again, emotion flickering briefly across her tired face before disappearing beneath quiet composure. Elias looked between them. I only bought medicine. Dakota studied him carefully for a long moment. No, he said softly. You gave away your future for someone else's child. The words settled heavily in the cold morning air. Elias felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest. Across the street, the church bells finished ringing. The sound faded slowly into silence, broken only by horses shifting in the mud and distant wind brushing through town signs. Then Sheriff Briggs stepped closer to Elias. You never told me you knew these people. Elias gave a tired half-smile. I did not. Briggs glanced uneasily toward the Apache riders. Then why would they do all this for you? Before Elias could answer, Dakota spoke again. Because debt is not always counted in money. The sheriff fell silent immediately. The old chief turned toward the gathered townspeople next. His voice never rose, but every person listening leaned closer without realizing it. Last night, many here closed their doors. His eyes moved slowly across the crowd. One poor rancher opened his hand instead. Nobody met his gaze. Vernon Mercer stood frozen outside his store, clutching his suspenders awkwardly while avoiding the chief's eyes entirely. The same men who laughed at Elias yesterday now stared at the muddy ground beneath their boots. Dakota stepped down from the bank porch and moved toward his horse. The riders behind him remained perfectly still, awaiting his lead. Before mounting, the chief paused beside Elias one final time. From inside his coat, he removed a small object wrapped carefully in cloth. He handed it to Elias without explanation. Elias unfolded the cloth slowly and found an old silver pocket watch resting inside. Worn, scratched, familiar. His breath caught instantly. "This belonged to Clara," he whispered. Dakota nodded once. "Your wife traded it years ago to buy blankets for hungry children during the hard winter." Elias stared at the watch silently while old memories rushed back like cold river water. Clara smiling beside the stove. Clara stitching coats by lantern light. Clara giving away more than they could afford because she believed kindness returned eventually, even when life did not seem to deserve it. Elias looked up slowly, eyes clouded with emotion. But Chief Dakota had already mounted his horse. The Apache riders turned together beneath the gray morning sky while the wind carried dust softly along the empty street. And before leaving Dry Creek behind, the old chief spoke one final sentence without looking back. "Your wife's kindness reached us long before yours did." By late afternoon, Dry Creek no longer looked at Elias Boone the same way. Men who had not spoken to him in years suddenly tipped their hats when he passed. Women who once crossed the street to avoid awkward conversation now nodded politely from store windows and porches. But Elias noticed something else too. Nobody looked him directly in the eyes for very long anymore. It was not respect alone. It was guilt. The kind that settled heavy after a man realized goodness had been standing beside him all along while he chose not to see it. Elias rode home slowly beneath a pale clearing sky while cold winds swept across the open plains. The silver pocket watch rested in his coat pocket close against his chest. He had opened it 3 times already during the ride just to hear the tiny ticking inside. Clara's watch. Clara's kindness. Somehow reaching across years after her death like a hand refusing to let him fall completely alone. Sadie moved carefully along the muddy trail while the last storm clouds drifted east toward the mountains. In the distance, the Boone Ranch appeared exactly as it had yesterday. Broken fences, lean horses, sagging barn roof leaning slightly west from years of hard weather. Yet something about the place felt different now. Lighter somehow. As Elias reached the front gate, he slowed suddenly. Someone had repaired part of the fence. Fresh cedar posts stood upright beside newly stretched wire still shining silver beneath the evening light. Elias frowned and dismounted carefully. He knelt beside the repaired section and touched the wood with rough fingers. Fresh cuts. Recently worked. He glanced toward the barn. More changes. The collapsed stable. Door had been rehung properly. One of the water troughs had been cleaned and filled. Even the old windmill beside the well turned smoothly now instead of grinding with its usual rusty groan. Elias straightened slowly, confused. Then he heard laughter. Soft, young, carrying faintly from behind the barn. He moved carefully around the corner and stopped. 3 Apache boys no older than 14 were carrying hay bales into the stable, while 2 older men repaired loose boards along the barn wall with quiet efficiency. Nearby, the Apache girl from town stood beside a cooking fire stirring something inside a cast iron pot. The smell of venison and herbs drifted warmly through the cool evening air. Everyone stopped briefly when Elias appeared. The boys looked uncertain at first, but the older Apache man beside the barn simply nodded respectfully and returned to hammering nails into the wood. Elias looked toward Naya. "What is all this?" She lowered the spoon slowly. "Chief Dakota said a man should not rebuild alone." Elias stared around the ranch again. More horses grazed peacefully near the creek now. Apache horses. Blankets hung drying beside the fence. Smoke curled upward from two small campfires near the cottonwood trees. The ranch no longer felt abandoned. Felt alive again. Naya stepped closer, holding a small bowl of stew carefully in both hands. "You have not eaten since yesterday," she said softly. Elias accepted the bowl slowly, warmth spreading through his cold fingers immediately. For a moment he simply stared at the steam rising into the evening air. Nobody had cooked for him since Clara died. The realization hit deeper than he expected. Naya watched him quietly. "Matto asked about you this morning," she said. "His fever is gone now." Elias nodded once, unable to speak immediately. He tasted the stew slowly while wind moved gently through the dry grass around the ranch. The Apache boys resumed laughing softly near the stable. Hammers tapped wood in steady rhythm. Horses breathed calmly beside the creek. Small sounds, peaceful sounds. Sounds Elias had forgotten a ranch could make when loneliness no longer lived there alone. As the sun lowered behind the hills, painting the plains gold and copper, Elias finally looked toward Naya again. "Why would your people help a stranger this much?" Naya's dark eyes drifted toward Clara's old cedar tree standing quietly behind the house. "Because kindness travels farther than fear," she answered softly. Then after a moment she added, "And because Chief Dakota remembers your wife." That night, light returned to the Boone Ranch for the first time in years. Warm orange lantern glow spilled through the cabin windows, while the smell of cedar smoke and stew drifted into the cool Oklahoma air. Elias sat quietly at the old wooden table listening to unfamiliar sounds around him. Boots crossing the porch. Soft Apache voices outside near the fire. Horses shifting calmly beside the stable. Life. Real life. Not the dead silence that had haunted this place since Clara passed away. The silver pocket watch rested open beside his coffee cup, ticking softly beneath the lantern flame. Across from him, Naya carefully folded strips of dried herbs into small cloth bundles, while steam rose from a kettle hanging above the stove. Her movements were calm and precise, almost musical in the quiet cabin. Elias watched her for a long moment before speaking. "Chief Dakota said he remembered Clara." Naya nodded gently without looking up. "My grandmother remembered her too." Elias frowned slightly. "Your grandmother?" Naya finally lifted her eyes. "Her name was Aponi. She died 3 winters ago." Something shifted in Elias's memory then. A small Apache woman with silver hair and sharp eyes sitting beside Clara near this very stove years ago, while snow piled outside the windows. Clara sewing blankets while Aponi brewed tea that smelled like pine needles and sage. Elias had not thought about that winter in over a decade. "Aponi," he whispered slowly. "Your grandmother used to bring medicine when Clara got sick." Naya smiled faintly. "And Clara gave food to Apache children when the soldiers burned our winter camps." Elias stared into the lantern flame silently. He remembered now. Hard winters. Hungry families arriving quietly at night so townspeople would not see them. Clara always opening the door anyway. Always sharing whatever little they had. Sometimes soup. Sometimes blankets. Once even their last sack of flour. Back then Elias used to worry they would never survive giving so much away. Yet Clara only smiled and said the same thing every time. Kindness never disappears. It only changes hands. Outside, laughter rose briefly from the fire near the stable where the Apache boys roasted corn beside the older ranch hands. Elias listened quietly while old memories moved through him like wind across dry grass. "Why did Dakota really come here?" he asked softly after a while. Naya stopped folding herbs. The room suddenly felt quieter somehow. "Because Matto is not only his grandson." Elias looked up. Naya's dark eyes reflected the lantern flame steadily now. "Matto is the last living son of Dakota's eldest daughter." She paused carefully. "If he died, another family inside the tribe would have claimed leadership." Elias slowly understood. There would have been fighting. Naya nodded once. Many people feared it. The wind outside rattled softly against the cabin walls. Elias leaned back in his chair heavily while the meaning settled over him. $1. One bottle of medicine. Somehow preventing something far larger than he ever imagined. Naya lowered her voice gently. Dakota says peace sometimes survives because one stranger chooses mercy before sunrise. Silence filled the cabin again. Then suddenly hoofbeats echoed outside the ranch, fast and uneven. Everyone near the fires rose immediately. Elias stood from the table as the cabin door burst open. Sheriff Briggs stepped inside, breathing hard beneath the cold night air. His hat and coat were covered in dust. "Boone," he said urgently. "You need to come into town." Elias frowned. "What happened?" Briggs glanced briefly toward Naya before lowering his voice. "Some men from Dry Creek rode out to Red Ridge tonight." His jaw tightened uneasily. "And they did not go there looking for peace." The warmth inside the cabin seemed to vanish all at once. Outside, the laughter near the fire had already stopped completely. The ride into Dry Creek felt colder than the storm the night before. Elias Boone and Sheriff Briggs crossed. The empty plains beneath a moon half hidden behind drifting clouds while the wind carried dust low across the trail. Neither man spoke much. Ahead of them, lantern lights flickered faintly through the darkness where the town rested beside the creek bed. But something about those lights felt wrong tonight. Too many. Too restless. As they reached the first buildings, Elias immediately saw horses tied outside Mercer's general store. More horses than usual. Men gathered beneath the porch awning, speaking in hard whispers, while rifles leaned casually against the wooden railing beside them. Vernon Mercer stood near the door, holding a lantern high enough to light several angry faces beneath broad hats and thick coats. The talking stopped the moment Elias rode into view. Sheriff Briggs dismounted first. "Everybody go home," he said firmly. "This ends tonight." Nobody moved. A tall rancher named Clyde Mercer stepped forward from the group, jaw tight beneath his gray beard. "Ends?" he muttered bitterly. "You think 20 Apache riders surrounding our town just ends?" Briggs lowered his voice carefully. "Nobody surrounded anything." Another man spat into the dirt. "That is easy for you to say. Boone got his ranch paid for while the rest of us sit wondering when Dakota decides Dry Creek belongs to him too." Elias felt anger stir slowly in his chest for the first time all day. Dakota never threatened this town. Clyde pointed toward him sharply. "You brought them here." Several men murmured agreement. Elias looked around at the faces gathered beneath the lantern glow. Fear. That was all this really was. Fear dressed up like pride. Men frightened of what they did not understand. The same fear that made them turn away a sick child yesterday. Sheriff Briggs stepped between the crowd and Elias. "Go home before somebody says something they regret." But Vernon Mercer suddenly spoke up from the porch shadows. "Maybe we should ask Boone why Apache warriors are repairing his ranch while our own people struggle to survive." The words landed hard. Elias slowly climbed down from Sadie and faced the crowd directly. Cold wind moved through the street carrying dust around their boots. "Those men rebuilt my fence because their chief chose gratitude over hatred," Elias said quietly. "Something this town forgot how to do a long time ago." Nobody answered immediately. Then Clyde gave a dry laugh without humor. "You think kindness changes what they are?" Elias looked straight at him. "No," he answered calmly. "Kindness changes what we are." Silence settled heavily across the street. Somewhere nearby a horse stamped against the frozen dirt while lantern flames flickered beneath the wind. Then suddenly another sound drifted through town. Singing. Soft at first. Low Apache voices carried from beyond the creek where small campfires glowed faintly against the hills. Not war songs. Prayer songs. Peaceful. Ancient. The angry tension in Dry Creek shifted awkwardly as people listened. Elias watched the faces around him slowly change beneath the lantern light. Confusion replacing certainty. Sheriff Briggs removed his hat quietly. Even Vernon Mercer stopped talking. The songs floated through the cold night air, steady and calm like water crossing stone. Then Naya appeared at the far edge of town, riding alone beneath the moonlight. No weapons. No fear. She stopped beside Elias and looked toward the gathered men carefully before speaking. Chief Dakota sent a message. Nobody moved. The Apache riders leave at sunrise. Murmurs spread softly through the crowd. Relief. Shame. Naya's dark eyes moved across the townspeople one by one. But before we leave, she said gently, the chief asks that Dry Creek remember something. She looked directly toward Vernon Mercer standing stiff beneath his lantern. A poor rancher gave away his last dollar for an Apache child. The night wind carried her voice through the silent street. And rich men gave nothing at all. Nobody spoke after that, because there was nothing left to argue with. Sunrise came slow over the Oklahoma plains the next morning. Thin gold light rolled across the hills and touched the Boone Ranch piece by piece like the land itself was waking carefully after a long hard winter. Frost clung to the fence posts. Smoke drifted softly from dying campfires near the cottonwood trees. And for the first time in many years, Elias Boone stepped onto his porch without the weight of debt crushing his chest. He stood there quietly holding Clara's silver pocket watch in one rough hand while the cold morning air moved through his gray hair. Below him, Apache riders prepared their horses in silence. Saddles tightened, blankets rolled, hooves pressed gently into frozen earth. No shouting, no celebration, just quiet movement beneath the pale dawn sky. Naya stood near the creek helping young Maddo onto a horse while Chief Dakota spoke softly with the older men near the barn. The repaired fences stretched across the ranch now straight and strong beneath the morning light. Elias looked at them for a long moment. Yesterday those fences marked the edge of a dying ranch. Today they looked like the beginning of something else entirely. Behind him, the cabin door creaked softly open. Sheriff Briggs stepped onto the porch carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He handed one to Elias without speaking. For a while both men simply stood watching the riders prepare to leave. "Town feels different this morning," Briggs finally muttered. Elias nodded slowly. Maybe people finally got tired of being afraid. Briggs gave a quiet laugh beneath his breath. Maybe they got tired of being ashamed. Wind moved gently across the ranch carrying the smell of cedar smoke and horses. In the distance, Vernon Mercer's wagon approached slowly along the trail from Dry Creek. Elias narrowed his eyes slightly as the wagon stopped near the gate. Mercer climbed down awkwardly holding a wooden crate in both hands. The storekeeper walked toward the porch without his usual sharpness. No pride, no excuses, just a tired old man beneath the morning sun. He stopped a few feet from Elias and set the crate carefully on the porch boards. Inside rested flour, coffee beans, canned peaches, dried meat, and fresh bread still warm beneath cloth wrapping. Mercer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Store had extra supplies," he muttered. Elias looked at him quietly. Mercer avoided his eyes. Figured a ranch getting rebuilt ought to have food in the kitchen again. Silence settled between them. Then slowly, almost painfully, Mercer added, "Your wife used to bring food to my family during the drought." Elias felt something tighten softly inside his chest. Mercer stared out toward the Apache riders gathering near the hills. "I forgot that for a long time." Elias nodded once. Most folks did. Mercer tipped his hat awkwardly and returned to his wagon without another word. Sheriff Briggs watched him leave before shaking his head softly. "Never thought I would live long enough to see Vernon Mercer apologize without using the word sorry." Elias smiled faintly into his coffee cup. Down by the creek, Chief Dakota mounted his horse at last. The Apache riders formed quietly behind him while morning sunlight reflected softly from silver beads and dark leather. Naya looked back toward the ranch one final time before guiding Maddo beside the chief. The young boy waved shyly toward Elias from horseback. Healthy color finally returned to his face. Elias lifted a hand back slowly. Then Dakota rode forward alone until his horse stopped near the porch steps. The old chief studied the ranch carefully beneath the golden sunrise. "Clara believed kindness was never wasted," he said softly. Elias looked down at the silver watch in his hand. The tiny ticking inside sounded louder somehow in the morning stillness. "I used to think she gave too much away," he admitted quietly. Dakota nodded once beneath the wind. And now, Elias watched the riders waiting peacefully beyond the cedar trees. He watched repaired fences standing where broken ones used to lean. He watched smoke rising from a warm cabin that no longer felt empty. Then he looked toward the hills where sunlight stretched endlessly across the open land. Now I think she understood the West better than the rest of us. Chief Dakota smiled faintly. Not wide, just enough to show old wisdom resting behind tired eyes. Then he touched 2 fingers gently to his chest in farewell before turning his horse toward the plains. Elias stood silently on the porch as the Apache riders disappeared slowly into the golden morning light one by one until only drifting dust remained beneath the wide open sky. The wind moved softly through the repaired fences around the Boone Ranch. Somewhere inside the cabin, Clara's silver pocket watch kept ticking steadily beside the stove. And out there on the endless frontier, where fear once traveled faster than mercy, people would remember the season a poor rancher gave away his last dollar and somehow became the richest man in Dry Creek.